Dark Souls 3 is an action-packed third-person RPG where you create your own character with a unique playstyle and tackle the challenges of the world, be it helping someone in need, discovering your way through a maze, or bringing down a really powerful boss. This is Globku from Noob, bringing you our official Dark Souls 3 review. The gameplay of Dark Souls 3 is pretty much what you would expect, but faster than what you're used to. Depending on the character you build, the game can feel quite different, but no matter your playstyle, it seems Dark Souls 3 has been heavily influenced by Bloodborne. The pace is much higher than a traditional Souls game, but it still has a lot of weapons and build options which we found Bloodborne kinda lacking. Me being a big fan of Bloodborne's fast pace and the freedom of Dark Souls, it's really great seeing the best of these two worlds come together. The variety of Dark Souls was even expanded with weapon skills. Each weapon now has an extra ability called the skill, which could change your playstyle significantly. This katana, for instance, has a parry, which allowed me to counter enemies vulnerable to parrying without having to get a shield. This is just a small example, of course. Weapon skills definitely bring something fresh to the Dark Souls formula, and some weapons have some really crazy skills that will make you want to try them out. The weapon skill costs you focus points, the blue bar next to your health, returning from demon souls. They are also used for magic, as you would expect, but if you're a melee character who relies a lot on his weapon skill, for the first time you might actually want to spend some points on attunement. There's a lot of convenient aspects returning from the previous Souls. You can warp to different bonfires from the start of the game, for instance. You also have a storage box from the get-go to organize your inventory should you desire. You've got several vendors on your main hub that will let you sell items. The one other thing I wish they did was to repair your weapon every time you died. Repairing your weapon works similar to Dark Souls 2. You simply need to rest a bonfire and your weapon durability goes up to 100%. So, I don't understand why they would make you rest after you respawn before you could move on. It's a minor pet peeve, but nothing sucks harder than having your weapon break in the middle of a boss fight. A lot of players come to Dark Souls for the challenge, and I must say that the difficulty was about on the same level overall, though a lot of the early boss fights felt very easy. While exploring the world, there are ambushes and new enemy types that sometimes you'll struggle to deal with. And on that note, the difficulty remains unchanged. It's just the boss fights for the first half of the game that are really easy. If you've played the previous Souls, you shouldn't find a big challenge in the first, let's say, 5 to 10 bosses. But the fights themselves show a lot of variety and creativity on their design. No two bosses felt the same throughout my entire playthrough, which is a huge step up from Dark Souls 2. I definitely felt like some bosses were designed to counter specific playstyles, so different players will struggle with different encounters, but the overall different ways in which they challenge you were very satisfying. The pace closer to Bloodborne paired with the diversity of Dark Souls made this gameplay truly something special for me. The difficulty while discovering the world is on par with the previous titles, and even if you find bosses too easy, there's always New Game Plus if you're looking for the extra challenge. The world structure of Dark Souls 3 is similar to Dark Souls or Bloodborne. The whole thing is a big maze full of shortcuts for you to discover. Each area has its own theme, and they are very distinguishable from one another, whether you're looking at the architecture of the buildings or the overall color palette. The variety was something I found mesmerizing, but at the same time, some of those areas were downright infuriating. Let's just say that I found in Dark Souls 3 something I hit more than Blighttown. There are a lot of callbacks and references to the previous games throughout these areas, and though I can appreciate a trip down memory lane once in a while, I found these callbacks to be a bit more frequent than I would like. In a way, it felt like I had to overcome a challenge that I had already bested before, so I ended up liking the game a lot more when it gave me something that was brand new, as opposed to something that was trying to trigger your nostalgia. I also found Dark Souls 3 to be a lot more benevolent with their bonfires and checkpoints, especially when close to a boss fight. There was always a quick path to get back to the boss should you die, which avoids those long walks of shame that are sometimes more frustrating than the boss fight itself. This was probably my favorite Souls to explore, but it was sad to see them relying on old tricks so much, whether it was for nostalgia purposes or simply because they ran out of ideas. It still deserves a very high score, just not a perfect one. Like the previous games, Dark Souls 3 has a main story with multiple endings. Throughout your journey, you will meet many characters, some of them brand new, others are returning or referencing old characters. There's really no explanation as to why some of these characters are coming back, and while some of them make sense, others just feel like fan service. On the bright side though, these stories are a lot easier to follow than the previous games. Through cutscenes and character dialogue, you'll be able to understand most of what's happening and whether or not you want to engage with a particular side story. The Souls' essence of storytelling isn't lost though. There's still a lot you can only truly understand through reading item descriptions, and even then there's a lot of space for speculation. I was never a fan of the way Souls try to tell a story. I think games have all the right to have secrets laid out for people to find, but I never liked not knowing my character's purpose as I aimlessly killed all the enemies that came before me. Dark Souls 3 3 got rid of that problem by being more upfront with its main premise, which I definitely appreciated, but once again, relying on returning characters for what felt like fan servicing was somewhat off-putting. Password matchmaking returns from Bloodborne. Should you be looking to join a friend in jolly cooperation, just match your passwords and you should be able to join without any major issues. Up to 4 players can cooperate this time around, and the frame rate will remain unchanged, unlike Bloodborne. Players can also join each other regardless of their soul level. The game will simply scale you down should you be overleveled. Joining another player's game or summoning a friend is a pretty fast process and a massive improvement over previous entries. PvP is kinda crazy, since you never know what you're getting yourself into. Because of these 4-player lobbies, a PvP scenario could take you up to an 8-player lobby, and it won't necessarily be a fair fight. When you choose to invade another world, you simply have no idea if you'll find a 1v1 duel, a 1v3, or a 4v4. There's just no way to tell. And while some players might find this crazy aspect of PvP somewhat unfair, it's something I really enjoyed. It was nerve-wracking invading someone, and while Dark Souls PvP already brought a lot of variety because of all the different builds your opponents could have, this brings another layer of diversity, which should keep PvP interesting for a lot longer. Consoles run slightly below 30 frames per second for most of the time, dropping frames here and there, especially when there's a lot of blood splattering, volumetric fog, or simply when you're sprinting and the consoles try to load up the textures around you. The PC version runs at 60 frames per second, but it's a lot more unstable. Some cutscenes and even a few areas seem to tank your frame rate real hard. Remember Blighttown, anyone? We've also seen and heard reports of the game crashing on specific situations repeatedly. It's hard to say if everyone will experience these issues because everyone has a different setup, and we also don't know if mods like DSFix will repair this in the future. But for now, consoles are a lot more stable, with the performance on PlayStation 4 being slightly better than the Xbox One, but the PC has the 60 frames per second. Having reviewed the game on the PlayStation 4, none of these performance dips were infuriating. Obviously, I would prefer a 60 FPS game to a 30 FPS, but it is stable enough to be classified as playable. Therefore, it gets a B rating. Overall, Dark Souls 3 is a great experience. You still have those areas that will frustrate you and a few bosses that don't pose that great of a challenge, but in the end, it's a game full of surprises, interesting characters, quests, and a lot more fluid gameplay than the previous games. This might very well be my personal favorite Souls. This game is truly something special. That was our review of Dark Souls 3. If it was useful to you, click that like button. It helps us out a lot and allows us to continue to do this stuff. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe for more gaming goodness. I've been Globku. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.